Hi guys, Claudia Boleyn here, and today's video is a video that I've wanted to make for a really long time, but it's been a complicated one to think about. Because when I've kind of spoken about it before, you'll know what it's about because of the title. It's about Shamima Begum. When I've spoken about this before, it's put me in quite a vulnerable position because I'm half Indian and I'm half English. So in the past, when I've spoken about issues like this, it kind of becomes an almost aggressive kind of guilt by association thing, where anybody who is, especially a woman of colour, talking about these issues, you end up facing a lot of racism, and some of the worst racism I've actually received, because I am mostly white passing, has actually been if ever I've spoken about issues like Shamima Begum or been in any way critical of any sort of British traditions or institutions, etc. And this is despite the fact that I'm a British citizen. I was born and raised here in Britain alongside friends of different races, but a lot of my white friends, we would have had the same, went to the same schools and everything. But the moment you start talking about these things as someone who's mixed, that's when you get attacked by a lot of people who want to say that you are a terrorist, that you're Britain hating, that you don't belong here, that you shouldn't be here, that if you don't like it you should go somewhere else, that you should go back to your country, which is a horrible thing to receive because this is my country. This is where I live, this is where I come from. I've never been to India, but those are the sort of things you get. So it can be quite intimidating if you're talking about an issue like this and you're someone who is mixed race, if you're not white. And I think especially when it came to matters about Shamima's citizenship, when you start talking about how it's quite a racist law they put in place, and it's often people of colour or women of colour who are the ones saying, actually, this doesn't make sense and this actually isn't fair, then you get a load more racism. So it's like you create a target. But I kind of got to a point in my life now where I've just realised, what's the point of me actually having a channel if I'm intimidated by that kind of thing? And I was really, really touched by what I saw. And if I can help in any way, or even just voice something that maybe other people would like to voice, but maybe wouldn't really want to put themselves out there or don't have the platform to, then I'm going to try and do it, because I really feel this very strongly and I have thought about doing this for a long time. So I watched a documentary the other day on BBC Two called The Shamima Begum Story, and in the documentary, which I'm going to put a link to in the description box if you're able to access the BBC where you're at, it's interviews with Shamima herself and interviews, snippets from other individuals who've been part of that story or have something to contribute, from kind of different angles and political persuasions. So that's kind of the documentary. I was so upset by the time I reached the end of the documentary, and I don't think anything's got me to that extent in a really long time, that I really genuinely did sit there feeling completely numb and dazed. And I just sat there with my thoughts, and I know that during the documentary I wanted to cry quite a lot. I'm quite an emotional person, but by the end of it I just felt this huge sense of injustice and unfairness and just pity and empathy for, in my opinion, a child that was groomed and was trafficked. So I'm going to give you like a little bit of a rundown. I mean, if you're watching this you probably already know the story of Shamima Begum. I'm going to give you a rundown based on what I saw in the documentary and the research I've done. Apologies if any of this is wrong, it's just a kind of recap kind of thing. So Shamima Begum was born here in Britain. She was born in London, born and raised in London, in Tower Hamlets. So she's from a Muslim family. She wasn't particularly into her religion until kind of later in her teen years. Tower Hamlets is a really multicultural part of London, and there's also a lot of poverty in London, because what you'll see if you're not from Britain or not from London is that you've got different parts of London. So you've got like the really wealthy parts of London, and then they're kind of right next to places where there really isn't much wealth, and it can be quite jarring, I think. So if you're not from Britain, someone saying that they're from London can mean so many different things, because there's so many different, if you ever go to London, you see some of the places in London are so wealthy, it's unbelievable. It really is unbelievable. And then, just a short tube ride away, you've got some of the poorest people. So Shamima talks initially about how she didn't feel like she really fitted in. She felt different because she was a Muslim, because she was a woman of colour, and she just felt a lot of Islamophobia. And I feel like regardless of what anybody thinks of her, I think it worries me when people try to undermine that. And I'm going to go on so many tangents in this video. But I have a really big interest in dismantling systems, and less focusing on people, to be honest. But when something happens, my interest is in working backwards through the stages to think, how did that happen and how do we prevent it from happening again? And to me, that's one of the most important things you can do. And something which is really sad to look into is how people are radicalized, right? Especially vulnerable young people get radicalized, indoctrinated, and they get groomed into these kind of mentalities. And the uncomfortable part about that, and this is controversial, I'm going to say it anyway, often, even when it comes to kids that have become very far right and they've committed maybe a shooting or they've become an incel, etc., it's very easy and human instinct for us to just say, well, that was just a bad person, because obviously the main victims are their victims, of course they are. But if we actually want to move forward and stop things like that from happening, I believe you have to actually look at how that happened. I don't believe it's very often, truly, that kids simply turn out like that. I think especially, you know, what we're seeing with more low-level stuff, with Andrew Tate, for example, kids are extremely vulnerable to this kind of radicalisation. And as, you know, Shamima speaks about, but it's not just in her case, lots of sorts of radicalisation. They specifically target young people who feel other, alone, unvalued. Often they might be quite emotionally immature or quite naive or not very worldly. And you even see this, you know, when you think about how some young white boys are kind of drawn into the sort of Andrew Tate incel world. It's not because, this is controversial to say, but it is not because they're bad. It's because they feel, often, I think often in certain ways it's because of poverty, and because in a capitalist system, rather than us looking at the top, you know, they turn people against other minorities. So you'll get working class white boys sometimes radicalized to hate immigrants, right? Rather than looking at the top and thinking, actually, we're all suffering under this system, that's how the system works. There are people who feel unseen and unworthy. And I think a lot of young white boys in these situations, we do have a crisis of masculinity right now, because we are kind of trying to transition out of patriarchy. And I do think it is probably quite jarring to be in a generation where the media you watch presents being a man a certain way, and that you're entitled to women, as our media does show us, you know, you do the right thing, you're entitled to women, that's the prize at the end. And then for these things to change and to not have the kind of adequate education for boys. I don't say that to excuse them, but I don't think it helps anyone to just act like, you know, oh, boys will be boys, boys are just like that. No, and it is very difficult. You know, for example, if we talk about radicalisation, it is very hard for us to think about the fact that it's a system, because human nature makes us want to think, it makes us want to go for the easy route. It makes us want to say, that's the bad person's been punished, and now it's finished and we can all go to sleep and not have to worry and we're all safe. But that's denial of reality, which is that a lot of kids, and any of us, could have been vulnerable to that sort of grooming. And it's hard to talk about when that victim also has victims. So in Shamima Begum's case, you know, when she went to the so-called Islamic State, obviously that group has a great many victims who people are going to prioritise. And it's the same when you've got boys that are being radicalised into this kind of far-right, violent, terrifying misogyny, because they've got victims. But my interest is in, for me personally, understanding it and stopping it. I will never stop believing, I have strong faith, that the majority of people are good. And I believe the majority of people have the capacity for good. And it is known that when these people get radicalised, they're usually radicalised because they're an easy target for radicalisation. Like, these people know exactly what they're doing when they choose these people. So already Shamima is saying, like, she didn't feel like she fitted in, you know, because she was a Muslim and there was Islamophobia. And people do not want to talk about that fact. And I think that's why we do need to talk about it, because eradicating Islamophobia is the key. If in response to people being groomed to the Islamic State, is to be more Islamophobic, that is doing a disservice to future victims and to future people who get hurt by them, because that is pushing those people to feel more othered, and they will search for people on the outside, right? They will be so much easier to pluck by people. So for me, the actual response to Shamima Begum from people, the Islamophobia, the lack of humanity, is the perfect recruiting tool for future grooming and for future trafficking, because they're going to use it. They're going to say, look how they've treated that girl. They're going to say, look how she's been treated in comparison to, say, a white girl. Look what they've done. Britain's just washed their hands of one of their own. This is what they think of you. They're going to use that for recruiting people. Anyway, back to the summary. So one of Shamima's best friends at school loses her mother, and then she becomes very religious, and she gets in touch with the Islamic State, and it seems that she's groomed as well. And then she goes. So this friend makes it to Syria. And once she's there, she's able to communicate with Shamima back in the UK. And she is telling Shamima how wonderful it is and how it's this utopia. And Shamima describes how she felt that it was like some sort of Islamic utopia where she could live freely, etc., etc. And, you know, I've seen a lot of grown adults sitting there saying, well, how naive, how ridiculous, she should have known. And yes, it was naive and it was ridiculous. But we're talking about a very isolated 15-year-old girl. People don't want to talk about this. 15-year-olds that are isolated are naive. They are vulnerable to these things. Apparently the police knew, they knew that her friend had been groomed and had gone over there. And they knew that Shamima and two of her friends were also at risk of being groomed and trafficked. But they didn't act to stop it. So the message didn't get through to the girls' parents. So by the time the girls start acting more quickly and more frantically, and they realise they've got to go sooner because they think they're going to be caught. So by the time they disappear, their parents and families are just in shock because they don't know how any of this has even happened. And Shamima's sister, and this is what I mean when I say it's racist. It's not that it's racist to hold Shamima accountable and to hold the Islamic State, so-called, accountable. But there's a lack of empathy which is missing, and understanding which would be present and is present when it's a white girl, right? When it's a different sort of grooming. Because when her sister's describing her, she says she was quiet, she was shy, she wasn't worldly, she'd never had a boyfriend, she'd only known her family and school for 15 years, she wasn't particularly brave or outspoken, she still slept in a bed with her mother. So we are looking at a young 15-year-old. And I know it sounds weird to say like young or old 15-year-old, but this is who they go for. They go for emotionally younger people. They are experts. We don't want to talk about this. They are absolutely experts at making those people feel, making those kids feel like they are empowered and they're doing this great thing and they'll have a wonderful life. Don't you want to get away from your boring life? And what teenager doesn't? I think a lot of teenagers are susceptible to that. And let's think about, for example, look at how the army recruits. I'm not saying the army is comparable to Islamic State, but the army does the same thing. It's the same, the promise of travel and brotherhood, right? And be brave and be noble, and you're on the right side, and you will be loved and you will be supported, and it's exciting. And we see young people, a lot of young working class people taken in by that. And obviously there's a lot of propaganda. So I didn't really know the extent of the propaganda until I watched the documentary. Obviously we know about the scary stuff that comes out, like executions and things like that. You hear about those a lot. But Shamima is saying, and I don't know whether she's telling the truth or not. It's impossible to know. I'm not able to know if she is. She says that she'd heard about those things, hadn't seen them, she'd heard about them, but when she spoke to her friend that was there, basically her friend was like, that's fake news, they're trying to make us look bad. Now, I do think that's plausible. Even if she did see them as well, I think this is the uncomfortable truth. It is plausible that to a 15-year-old who is being radicalised and groomed, that she would believe, potentially, that, oh, it's for a reason, they're trying to make it look bad. If she's already coming from a place where she's suffering Islamophobia, she is absolutely ripe to be conditioned, right, to think that everything that's coming out about Islamic State is a lie. Because they hate us, right? You know how they hate us. You felt it yourself. That's how they do it. Now she's being instructed along with her two friends by grown adults online how to get over there, right? And made to think that it's going to be kind of easy thing to do, a good thing to do. And she says she has her doubts, but she was the shy one in her friend group. And I don't believe she's saying this to get out of it, just as a personal opinion, because I think she does also say that she feels bad because she's also complicit. She's not saying, I was quiet, therefore I'm not to blame. In a lot of ways, you know, her friends, we believe, are both dead. And she speaks about how she feels guilt and just dreadful the fact that if she had said at the time that she was having doubts, they might still be alive. So she holds herself accountable for that. So once she gets there and she and her friends make it over, that's when she starts to have some doubts. So she gets picked up, I believe, by some men with guns. And in her mind, she says, she tells herself, at first she's a little bit nervous, but she tells herself it's fine, they're just using guns to protect us. And I've seen people, again, grown adults, saying, well, how could she possibly believe that? That's how it works. Like, I understand it's uncomfortable and it doesn't make sense, but that's because she's a 15-year-old. She's a 15-year-old who's been groomed and been radicalised. It's like on a lesser scale. I mean, think about Donald Trump and the fake news thing, right? So think about when sometimes to some people they've been so radicalised by that if something bad comes out against Donald Trump, which is documented, they will say, that's fake news. They're just trying to smear him. It's just fake news. It's not real. That's just the mainstream media trying to smear him. And in some cases that might be true, but in some cases it isn't. People do have a bias. And we are talking about a radicalised child. I feel like at the centre of this is a radicalised child. Shamima describes the grooming as being in love with the idea of the Islamic State. And I've seen grown adults saying, how can she possibly say that, and taking her words out of context. She's actually describing that is the grooming system. That's radicalisation. It's almost like, it is like an abusive relationship. You know, that's how it works. That's how people get into cults. It's this idealised, all-encompassing thing which will solve all of your problems. And you get conditioned that anything you hear against it is just a lie. It's just a lie, and anyone who speaks against it is a liar. She gets there and it's different to what she thought, but it's still okay because they're being treated kind of like celebrities, her and her friends, because people there can't believe that they've made it over. And something I thought about when I was watching this was how normalised it was to the girls, in the sense that they thought they were doing something that, you know, oh, loads of people have done it before, it's a great thing to do, and then they kind of go there and everyone's shocked, which I think was something that, you know, really raised red flags, because I'm thinking they know full well that these kids have been groomed and that they were made to think it was like relatively normal, but actually it's incredibly rare and dangerous. And then Shamima and her friends go into an unmarried women's, I think it's a hostel or something. There's a lot of women there who obviously unmarried, there's children in there, it's very cramped, the conditions aren't very good, and I think Shamima starts to realise that these videos she's seen, which are propaganda of like a utopia, right? So kids on the street having fun, it's safe, it's like a Muslim paradise is how it was kind of sold to her. She realises that isn't actually the case because she doesn't have autonomy. Now, of course, to us as adults looking in, we're thinking, what did you think was going to happen if you went there? Did you think you'd have freedom? But we're talking about a groomed 15-year-old who's been indoctrinated. That is why it doesn't make sense. The fact that it doesn't make sense, for me, shows you that she's been indoctrinated. So she ends up there, and the only way out at that point is to be married. So she agrees she wants to be married. And at this point, the story gets even darker, because it's not just a groomed and trafficked child. She is then paired up with a husband, and she's a minor, and he basically wants an obedient wife who will do whatever he wants, who will cook for him, and who'll bear his children. And he specifically, now he's Dutch, so he specifically, when he talks in his interview, talks about how she was like a blank canvas, and that's what he wanted. And that's abuse, right? Because he wants a young girl that is so isolated and unworldly and has never had a partner that he can totally control, be in control of every aspect of her life, and she will do his complete bidding. And so Shamima agrees to marry him because he's quite pleasant to her at first, and she says, you know, he has a decent sense of humour, and we both speak English, and very quickly it seems that they trauma bond. Because again, we're talking about a child who's gone to a dangerous place, and we're also not thinking about the fact that to run away from that place means you could be, if you're caught, killed or tortured. And especially because they're so famous, right? So people know they're there. And this is a 15-year-old. And she went over there with her friends. So this isn't the sort of person who went there on her own. So getting away on her own is going to be extremely difficult. So it seems that she trauma bonds with him. And she does say that she loves him. And I'm watching this and I'm thinking, wow, I mean, we've gone from abuse to abuse. Because her whole life, her safety depends on this man who has all power over her. And in these situations, you do develop a sort of trauma bond, which can kind of be confused for love, because this person is your safety. And in a situation like that, especially for a child, you need them to survive. So you develop a sort of love for them, because them being good to you keeps you safe. And remember, she's also got nobody. It's just her and him. And she even says herself that she felt like she had to give her body to have any sort of freedom. But it's a trick, isn't it? It's not freedom, it's going into another form of oppression. And yes, she is naive. But again, you know, all these people saying, oh, she should have known better. Why didn't she figure these things out? Because she was 15. Because she was 15. She was a young and naive 15-year-old. I do not think truly that this is the sort of life, if you actually think about it, that she would have wanted. It sounds absolutely horrific. So after 10 days, her husband is put into prison, and she's put into the care of, I think they said an Egyptian, quite high up person who isn't named because they're quite scary or, you know, known to be quite dangerous. And Shamima doesn't name them. Shamima won't name them. And again, you know, people aren't using their empathy, because people are saying, well, why doesn't she just name them? If you actually watch the documentary and see what people are saying, why do you think it might be that a very famous girl who knew what kind of went on, and who isn't safe at the moment because she's currently in a Syrian refugee camp, so she's not in a safe space, why do you think she might not name him? Using your brains and your empathy. And again, this is why I think she needs to come home, because there's no way that she can provide the proper intelligence to prevent this happening again when she's not in a secure place. So she says she was basically confined to a room and a building because there wasn't much freedom, and some other people have said that she received religious instruction and training, and she denies receiving any of this. And I don't know if she's telling the truth or not, but what I do know is that a 15-year-old in that situation, I don't think it's actually too bizarre or too far-fetched to imagine that if you're 15 and there, and you feel like you're afraid, and you have no one, and you don't want to be tortured or killed, I imagine you'd go along with a lot of things. I think you'd go along with quite a lot to survive. Honestly, just being completely honest and empathetic. If you put yourself in those shoes at that age, I think you'd be absolutely terrified. When he comes home from the prison, he feels alienated from his friends, her husband, and so he abuses her. He takes it out on Shamima. And it's almost like Shamima can't even talk about what happened because she still has affection for him. There's still the trauma bond, because she still was in a situation where he was in control of everything. Her safety, and they did form a sort of bond, which is common in these situations. I've seen people saying, how can she be abused by him? She says she loves him. It's the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard. If you look at grooming relationships and abusive relationships, it's so normal for the abuse victim to develop a trauma bond, which they believe is love, for their abuser. So Raqqa, where they are, is falling, and it's like a war zone, bombs are dropping. Shamima's pregnant. Shamima has a daughter by this Dutch guy, by this Dutch man, and she says that she put everything into her daughter. You know, her daughter was what she thought about, how she got through her days. She focused on that role, which makes sense because it's the only sort of control she would actually have. She also goes on to have a son, very soon after, which again is quite worrying, because remember, she doesn't have the power to say no. That's not a power she possesses. So she's got 2 children, and her and her husband basically try to flee the bombing. One of Shamima's friends is killed in a bomb, and they flee, and there's no money to buy food. Shamima is not able to make milk. They are eating grass, whatever they can eat, and Shamima's little boy dies. Sorry, it's a horrible thing to talk about, but he dies. She deals with the death of her son. And then her daughter is so malnourished that she eventually dies as well. And Shamima talks about how her daughter was everything to her, and she thought about killing herself at that time, because she didn't want to be alive without her daughter who'd got her through this, which makes sense if you kind of think about a hostage situation, a kidnap situation. It's a very similar mentality. But she's pregnant again. She's pregnant again with another little boy. So it's at this point that her and her husband flee. They walk for days and days, and she's heavily pregnant, and then they're separated because she goes into a refugee camp, a Syrian camp for women and children, I believe. And this is where things just get even darker. So I honestly feel like this is a girl who has been through hell, was trafficked and groomed, tried to survive, and this should be the end of her ordeal, in my opinion. I'm not saying that she shouldn't be questioned and vetted, because I think there are so many. Of course she should be. Of course she needs to be seen by psychologists and, the police if necessary. Even the Secret Services. Anything that they can gather about this is incredibly important. But she was a groomed and trafficked child. So she's seen 2 of her children die already. And I believe from the interviews and images we've had of her, you can see someone who is incredibly, incredibly traumatised. And then I've seen people say, oh, she's not reacting properly. Look, she's like a psychopathic person. She's not reacting. Maybe, but maybe it's because she's completely traumatised by what's happened and where she is, and the fact that she is a grooming and child trafficking victim. I think it's very easy for us to make these judgments on somebody's body language, but she needs to be in the care of psychologists and counsellors who can ascertain that better. She wants her child to live, the child that she's carrying, so she applies to try and come back to the UK. And she gives birth in the camp. And it is 2 days after she gives birth, and you can see that she's exhausted, she's traumatised. And I just want to say, actually carrying the children of your abuser is quite horrific in itself. That must be incredibly complicated. And it is at this time that the press go to her and basically try to make her a further hate figure, and to tell her live on air while she's holding her newborn son that she's been stripped of her citizenship and she can't come back. And her reaction is just complete numb despair, but also like she's in hell anyway, and why she didn't even get her hopes up about it. She's just thinking, well, okay, I guess that's just it now. I'm in hell, what can I do? She can't even cry about it, and she's got this baby, the baby by the man that abused her. And I think it's really sick looking back on that, the way she was treated. So that's shown all over the UK, I remember that. And people were saying, her son should be brought here because he's only a baby and he might die in the camp, and we have a responsibility towards him, we have a responsibility towards her. There was this whole debate going on, and there were people saying, no, she's made her bed and he's not one of us, and he's got no right to be here, doesn't matter what happens to them. And then the worst thing happens, because the little boy dies. He dies of pneumonia in the camp. And Shamima is being watched at the time, and he goes into like a hospital room and she's there with him, and he dies. And she's left there with her dead son all night. And she's so numb, she just says, I think my son's died. They bury him, and that's that. She's back in the camp. There's no way that she can come home. She's not safe. She can't talk properly about what even happened, because there are other people in that camp and it's not secure. There is nowhere to go for safety because she's been made stateless. And that's where she is to this day. I believe she's still in that refugee camp, and she is in an incredibly vulnerable position, still there, talking to the press as she has. And to me, she seems like somebody who feels like she has nothing to live for anyway. And I just became very deeply upset watching that. So I just wanted to talk very briefly about how they removed her citizenship and how incredibly wrong it is and how racist it is. Because basically in the UK, citizenship can be removed by the government for certain circumstances. So the first is if it is for the public good and would not make the person stateless. And the second is the person obtain their citizenship through fraud. And the third is that their actions could harm UK interests and they could claim citizenship elsewhere. So the big argument is, now Shamima Begum was born here. She's British. She was born and raised in London. She's only ever known London. But her father, I believe, has Bangladeshi citizenship. Now, the argument the British government gave to strip her of her citizenship was to say, well, she wouldn't be stateless if we removed her citizenship because she could apply for citizenship in Bangladesh. Now, this was against international law because you cannot just make a person stateless. So Bangladesh themselves have said, no, she can't claim citizenship here. That actually doesn't count. You would be making her stateless. And also, I believe if she went to Bangladesh anyway, she would be at risk of being killed because of terrorism laws. I might be wrong, but that's what I've read. So that's not a viable option. So to make someone stateless is immoral and it's completely against international law. And it's what they've done to Shamima Begum. And it's only possible because they claim she's a dual national, right? Or her parents came from somewhere else. The reason why this is so racist and dangerous is that it can only really be used on people who have heritage from different places. So if Shamima had joined the so-called Islamic State with a white British friend whose family have come from Britain, it would be much more difficult to make them stateless because they couldn't say, oh, they can claim dual nationality. Essentially, it's saying you are no longer a member of this country, you can't have citizenship here because you've got blood from somewhere else. So it's a different rule for people depending on their background. So I was thinking about this, with regard to me and my brother, because we are half Indian. And I believe via the Indian citizenship laws, potentially we fall in that group where they could potentially remove our citizenship and make us stateless, or they'd say it wasn't making us stateless because they'd say go to India, even though we've never been there, because there's the possibility, because of our heritage, that, they could say, oh, you've got connections somewhere else, you have to go somewhere else. But that's somewhere we've never been to. So if we committed the exact same crimes with our white friends, we'd be treated differently. So obviously that's racist. And it's, it's xenophobic as well. It's not just racist because it's someone who has connections to other places isn't British in the same way someone else is. You're conditionally British because they can take it away from you if you do something they don't like. Now, it doesn't matter if you're a white British serial killer, right, and you've killed loads and loads and loads of people. They don't go, oh, you've gone against British values and we're going to make you stateless. Think about how they're using this. They're not removing citizenship from white murderers, right? Serial murderers of real evil. So the UK has a responsibility under international law not to leave a person stateless. But they've done it. They've made Shamima Begum stateless. And it is all the more concerning and worrying because she was a child victim that was trafficked. And I'm going to be controversial and I'm going to say even if she wasn't, even if she was evil, right? If she was a grown adult when she'd done it and she knew what she was doing. If the argument is that this is for the public good, right, and for the good of humanity and to protect people, then it is not protecting people for a threat to be among all those different people out there, potentially going somewhere else, right? It's like basically pushing our dangerous individuals and washing our hands of them and saying, just go somewhere else. If the argument is that she's meant to be so dangerous, then don't we need her here? Don't we need her, since she was born here, to be put through the British courts, to be held in a British prison? If that's the argument, don't we need to know what she's doing and who she's communicating with so that she wouldn't be radicalising other people? Like, if that's the argument people are making, that she's so dangerous, then why on earth is she there? It's not to help the public good. It's just to make a point, and it's to punish her. It doesn't protect anyone. And if we're talking about the public good and we genuinely mean that, and we want to stop this from happening again, which is the aim, then we need to learn from people like Shamima Begum, because she is going to have information about how that process worked. She's going to have information about what it was like there in Raqqa, you know, how she experienced it, how she saw other people being groomed. She's going to have so much information to give about why she was vulnerable, exactly how she was groomed, how they got to her, who are they preying on, what's the playbook. This is valuable information for us, isn't it? To stop it from happening again. And all it's really doing, if we're completely honest, this is not in the public good or humanity's good. By doing this to a child victim, by washing our hands of her and saying that because she's of mixed heritage, she's not British, all that is now doing is enabling more trafficking and grooming, because they're going to use that. People who are preying on these kids, who already feel like they don't belong, they're going to use Shamima Begum as an example. The British government is basically making it possible that more people will be radicalised. Because they'll say, look what they did to Shamima Begum. You know, you're not one of them. Because they think that, you know, they can strip away your citizenship. They don't care about you. Even though you were born here and you grew up here and this is all you know, they think they can just send you somewhere else because you're of different heritage. Do they really not think that the people who are radicalising these kids are going to use that? Because of course they are. We talk about how Britain is meant to be this place we're so proud of and we're so tolerant, right? And we're so advanced and fair and just. So I don't really know how these people can possibly believe that even if Shamima Begum in your mind is the worst criminal imaginable, then is she not our responsibility? If you believe the British justice system is one of the best in the world, then she needs to go through the British justice system. Surely. She needs to be seen by people who are experts in the field. She needs to be seen by psychologists and experts in radicalisation and the security services and the police, and she needs to be assessed so that we get a clearer picture of exactly what happened. You know, all this speculation of, well, maybe she did this, maybe she did that. Maybe we'd find out if we brought someone who is British. You can't take away from, you know, we can't live in a world where someone is British, is radicalised here in Britain, and then they do something we don't like, so they're no longer British anymore. That's not how it works. You know, it would be like us suddenly saying, right, we've got a load of murderers in our jails who've killed a load of people and are very dangerous, but we're taking their citizenship away because they don't fulfil British values, and we're just going to let them go. We're just going to put them somewhere else. So then what? So you're saying that us, this great place, is going to just put all these dangerous people somewhere where they can get away and go somewhere else and not be monitored? How is the safest place for people who are dangerous not an environment where they're being monitored by experts? Shamima Begum's lawyers have tried to challenge the fact that she's had her citizenship taken away and been made stateless. But this is the sickness, you know, and people who talk about how fair the British justice system is need to think about this. Because she's in a complete state of limbo right now, because she's been told basically that if she wants to contest the situation, she has to do that from Britain. But how can she do that? How can she contest the situation and advocate for herself fairly, which is what we expect from British justice, right? And the British justice system, that every person gets to at least have their say. How can she do that when she's not even allowed to be heard because she's not allowed into Britain? This doesn't feel like anything other than a punishment. You know, it feels like when asylum seekers try to seek asylum, and you are allowed to, you go to a place and you seek asylum there, and it's being changed that, oh, you know, you actually can't do that, you have to seek asylum from elsewhere. And it's ignoring the fact that often you have to be in a place of safety in order to even seek asylum. Because if you're coming from somewhere which is so dangerous, you're not going to be able to, you know, the first priority is to get out before you can do any of that stuff. You know, we just have to apply some empathy and some humanity here. So I just wanted to make this about the Shamima Begum story, and I intend to listen to the podcast. I feel like, I hope that it won't create too much racism towards me. It has in the past. But I feel like this is something really important to talk about. And I feel like if we're really honest with ourselves and we say, posturing aside, initial responses aside, human emotions aside that we all do feel in the moment, what's the best outcome that we can possibly have? And I would say that the best outcome would be preventing further radicalisation. Because every time someone's radicalised, they have the potential to radicalise others. And to me, this is not solving any sort of problem at all. And I understand that people feel extremely strongly. I get that. That's human. It's completely human to be disgusted and to see what goes on and just to be absolutely appalled. But are we interested in basically just covering our eyes and our ears and just saying, oh look, that's evil, not our business? Or are we interested in doing the difficult thing, which is trying to figure out how it happens and how people are recruited and how we can stop people being recruited? Because to me that saves more lives, surely. Anyway, hopefully I haven't got anything wrong in this. I try not to. I know it's a really serious issue that I take very seriously. So thank you for watching this. I really appreciate it. Yeah, alright, I love you loads, and I will see you really soon, and I really, really do hope that Shamima Begum is allowed to come home, because this is her home, and no matter what you think of her, or any of us think of her, she was born here and she is British, and if she's done wrong, she should face the British courts, and if she's a victim, then she needs to receive support from us here. So yeah, thanks a lot, and I'll see you really soon. Bye!